So thank you everyone for coming out. I happen to be a mother, so much for that. No, we celebrated earlier in the day. So I wanted to first introduce our panelists, and then we'll get into this discussion, which should prove to be very interesting. It's a topic that personally really interests me. Before I was editor of Art News, I'm also happen to be editor of Art in America as well. Before I did that, I reported on the art market for about 15 years, starting at the sadly now defunct Art and Auction magazine and artinfo.com. And then I went on to do more reporting when I was the culture editor of the New York Observer, and we had a website called Gallerist. And from there, I went to Art News, and now I mostly edit what we do. But on Art News, we have up to the minute reporting on all of these issues that have to do with the art market. And I would say the issue that we're talking about today, how are collections built? Not just how are collections built, but how are collections maintained, has implications not just for the individual collector, but in fact for how, let's say, the public will see art in the future. Because you have to remember that many of these collectors are trustees at institutions, and those that are not trustees at institutions are perhaps building institutions. So we'll get to that. So first, let's introduce our panelists. To my immediate left is Sean Kelly, the owner of Sean Kelly Gallery. He established the gallery in 1991, and over the past 30 years, it's garnered international attention for its collaborations with renowned cultural institutions, coordinating numerous exhibitions on behalf of its artists at an array of prestigious museums. In 2012, the gallery opened its current space in Hudson Yards, and in September 2022, opened a major new space in Los Angeles. I would just add, I was asking Sean Kelly about the Frieze Art Fair. He's 3 blocks away. So if you go to the Frieze Art Fair, you merely have to walk 3 blocks and you can see an amazing exhibition he has about
Kehinde-Wiley, yeah.
Kehinde-Wiley, which I have not seen yet, but I will see probably when I go to Frieze. And then to Sean's left is Megan Fox Kelly. Megan is a professional art advisor who builds and manages collections for individuals, museums, estates, and foundations internationally. She advises clients in acquisitions and sales, estate planning and execution, and strategic planning for museums and artist foundations. As president of the Association of Professional Art Advisors, Megan is the definitive voice in art advisory. And then to Megan's left, we have Colin Bailey. He is the director of the Morgan Library and Museum, which I hope all of you have gone to in New York. It really is one of the gems of the city. He is the director, as I say, of the Morgan Library and Museum, a scholar of 18th and 19th century French art. He's a specialist in Renoir. His book, Patriotic Tastes, Collecting Modern Art in Pre-Revolutionary Paris, was awarded the Mitchell Prize for Best Art History Book of 2002 to 2003, and he continues to write for the New York Review of Books and Burlington Magazine. So what I would like to do first, as a kind of first round, if you will, is I would like to just go in this direction from me and ask all 3 of you who play who play particular roles in the art ecosystem to describe your role in building an art collection, in building art collections. So I don't know if we can reduce this to a few sentences, but let's try. So Sean, as an art dealer, what is your role in building art collections in terms of collector clients you've worked with for a long time in building up their collections and developing their taste, their emphasis, their intellectual, and of course, working with art advisors?
Well, I think historically, in the best possible context, art dealers who are very close to the artists normally used to be, I think, regarded as a sort of font of knowledge with regard to artists, and were very useful in terms of building collections. And it's certainly something that we do assiduously, and we've built many collections over the years. We still work with clients we've had for over 30 years, and indeed a number of those collections have now gone into major institutions around the country and around the world. So, I mean, it's something which I think is about connoisseurship, and it's about having a long-standing relationship with artists. I mean, obviously the growth of the professional class of advisors has been somewhat more recent in one sense, and it complements what we do, and you know, it's more independent because, of course, we're self-interested, we're dealers. But you know, I think the best of us can behave in a non-self-interested way, and it's actually one of the great pleasures of doing what we do is to work with people over a long period of time, to advise and build collections, and to be able to work outside our own coterie of artists as well, because we, you know, most dealers are collectors, and we have very Catholic taste, and we work with a lot of artists that we don't represent. So, you know, historically, I think it's an incredibly important and vital role for us, and one that I really enjoy. So.
And I'm going to ask a few questions along the way as our panelists describe their relation to this particular topic. So considering that you started the gallery way back in the early 90s, are there collections that you would say are deep into the Sean Kelly program?
Yeah.
And well, okay, so do you feel it's your responsibility, however, to say, okay, it's, you know, encourage them, I think you were just saying this, to look outside your program as well? Absolutely,
absolutely, because, I mean, I think one of my mantras is that context is king. And I think the context of how you position an artist is extraordinarily important. And, you know, in many of the works that, you know, collections that we've advised, we want to go backwards as well as forwards. I mean, it's incredibly important with certain artists that you establish a sort of a groundwork for them. So particularly artists that, you know, fit the historical profile of our program, for instance, you know, one thinks of Duchamp or Yves Klein, and artists who are involved with the performative or the more conceptual aspects of the 20th and 21st century. Many of the artists that we work with are they're the children of those artists. And I think it's incredibly important if you can get people to go on that journey, to go back historically to establish a groundwork and a framework for those artists, and then also to be looking for the next generation as well.
Okay, so I'm going to ask you one more question, which is, and this often comes up in a jokey way on the Jerry Gagosian meme account, which is the idea of nothing is available to you, which is the joke that you can't just walk in off the street and say, I would like to buy a Kehinde Wiley. So my question in that regard is, when you have collectors come to you, you know, so-called collectors, you have no idea who the person is, they walk in, they say, I want a Kehinde Wiley. Your client is the artist, right? So you are essentially also protecting that artist from irresponsible collecting, i.e. flipping at auction.
Yeah, but this is a little bit of a trope, isn't it? I mean, the idea that you know, you can't have access to anything and you can't buy anything, I think is sort of pathetic and ridiculous.
It's overblown.
I think it's completely overblown. Very early on in my career, when I was a curator and a museum director, I was working with a famous rock musician who could basically have bought most galleries out single-handedly, advising him. And at the time, he was making a video very early on in the days of videos for MTV, and he was dressed as a tramp. And in between takes on this video, we would go to galleries in between, and I would go in with this incredibly famous rock star that nobody could recognize, who was dressed as a tramp. And I can't tell you the number of galleries that just blew us off, because, you know, they looked at the cover of the book, they didn't look at the content. And, you know, I learned a big lesson through doing that, and that is that you don't discount anybody. Right. Everybody who comes into our gallery, we take very seriously. We take their interest very seriously, because you cannot tell. And, you know, I was talking to a dealer here the other day who was telling me that, you know, the largest group of collectors for Basquiat are now 30 to 35 years old. How can you tell if they're serious collectors when they turn up in torn jeans and sneakers? So it's very important not to judge a book by its cover.
Right. Well, and I think that is actually a good segue to Megan, because what you do is work with collectors in not only building their collections, but maintaining their collections, and you're even working with the afterlife of those collections. And I think, the segue I was thinking of is the idea that a collector who is one of maybe the people in the t-shirt and ripped jeans who is in fact worth $10 billion in tech money, making this up, but it's true, might seek out someone like yourself because they feel and I've talked to people like that, who they feel intimidated by the art world because they see, it's a very exclusive place, nothing will be available to me, I don't know how to talk to art dealers, and they might seek out someone and announce their intentions to build something. So maybe you can tell us what your role is as an art advisor.
Exactly. And you just described it. That is very much my role. And sometimes it is a very new collector who just wants to get started out, a young couple. Sometimes it's people who have been collecting for a while and they're wanting some direction. But I think the commonality when people are seeking advice, whether they're seeking advice from someone like myself who's an art advisor, from a museum expert, a curator, or a museum director like Colin, or from a gallerist like Sean, they're seeking expertise. And so what they want from me is expertise. It's just it's coming in a different form. I don't represent artists. I do work with artist endowed foundations, but I don't represent them. I don't have an inventory. That's one of the pillars of the APAA. And so some people might come to me because they want to access lots and lots of different options. They want to be able to understand, sometimes coming into a fair like TEFOF or a fair like Frieze, it's the art is swirling around them and they don't even know where to start.
Right.
They don't know sometimes what it's okay to like, right? They're really questioning all of that. So it's not only, what artist should I be looking at, but what particular painting or sculpture or object by that artist. So vetting quality, which is, the word that Sean just used, which we use all the time, connoisseurship. And it's funny, Sarah, that sometimes I hear lately that connoisseurship is sort of this very old-fashioned term, right? That it's a little out of date. The idea of expertise and making really careful decisions and doing research to understand the artist that you want to engage with or the historical object that you want to acquire. And I think that connoisseurship has to be the foundation of all of our practices, whether it's within the museums, within galleries, or art advisory.
Yes, it's interesting because someone was asking me what is connoisseurship, and I
Right.
said it's the difference between a good painting and a great painting
It's really
by the same artist.
It's really
And it's really as simple as that.
It's very true.
And yes, and so just to be clear, just for our audience here, Sean's client is the artist. Your client is the collector.
It is.
And I want to get into the history of art advising after we kind of go around here, but in terms of, I think one thing that people might be curious about off the bat is how is the relationship structured between you and a collector? Are you retained by collectors? Do you just do one-off deals? So how does that relationship work?
All of those things. And even among the members of the Art Advisors Association, the APAA, we work with clients in different ways. So I am on retainer by some of my collectors. Mm-hmm. I am retained by some collectors to help them with one decision.
Right.
I might be retained by an estate simply to help to settle that estate, and the relationship is finished once the estate is settled. And so there are any number of combinations of retainers and hourly, of commission structures. I think the important thing is that it's transparent, that it is contracted, that it is clear and communicated.
So just to add some color because of the setting that we're in here at TFAF, when I was here on Thursday during the preview day of the fair, I saw numerous art advisors with their clients going through the fair, going to different booths. So I mean, this will be enlightening for me as well. I might actually ask you this in an interview. When we're seeing art advisors going around a fair like this with their clients, what are the conversations that are taking place?
Millions of conversations. A lot of times we're getting, or most of the time, we're getting advance information from the gallerists, as collectors do too. This is what we're bringing to the fair. So we have sort of a war plan, right?
So
like
before the fair even opens, you'll be sent a PDF, this is what we're bringing.
This is what we're bringing.
Right.
And we're looking through all of that as soon as we're receiving that information and making plans not only for the collectors who will be there with us, but for the collectors who can't come. And most of our collectors just couldn't come this week. We work for people who are really too busy to just, drop it in the middle of a Thursday.
So you're basically their eyes.
We are their eyes, exactly. And in some cases, we will buy on their behalf without them there. In most cases, it's more of a conversation. And it's hard in a fair because, the galleries, sell a lot of the material that's already in the fair. So we might miss out if they're not able to come.
Yes.
Exactly.
All right, so we're going to return to art advisors in a moment. I want to turn to Colin because it might seem unusual to some of you to have a museum director on a panel that you might think is focused on the art market, on buying art, on a place of commerce, in a place of commerce like TFAF. In fact, the art in museums comes from somewhere. Somewhere along the line, someone acquired it and gave it to a museum. Museums, of course, also acquire art. I'm sure some museums acquired some art at TFAF. I certainly saw some things that were museum-worthy in there. So, Colin, maybe you can tell us both sort of what role you play in terms of your trustees, but also give us a little historical context for the museum as almost an art advisor in itself.
I quite wondered why I was asked as well, to be honest. But
we needed some oomph. We needed some institutional.
I would say that when Morgan, I work at the Morgan Library, but he's representative of the whole generation. There's a conversation recorded where he, at a London dinner party, he says, "I am not accustomed to being told you should buy this, you should buy that. I buy what I like, and I know what I like, and I will buy what appeals to me." And that's about 1900. It's partly true, but it's not at all true on the other side, because he's surrounded. He's a very busy man. He's working fully in the finance world, and he's surrounded by a number of experts, connoisseurs, some dealers, some family members, some scholars, and he's collecting in 20, maybe 10, 20 different areas. And in a way, the museum, it's still a little bit like that. We have, in some ways, so many areas that even at the Morgan, but if you're thinking of an encyclopedic museum, a civic museum, which has from antiquity to contemporary art, you are an ecosystem with scholars, curators. You have collectors on the board who you are helping, but there are also quite careful rules in trusteeship. A trustee can't just drop a work off in the conservation lab and have it restored. That's not their fiduciary responsibility. They are some way hands off. We are also at the Morgan, as an example, we have started to collect in modern and contemporary only 15 years ago. Morgan had no interest in that. The collections, even long after he died, in a sort of somewhat mind-boggling curatorial restrictiveness, they decided, there was no rule, but they decided if you were born after 1832, you were too modern to be at the Morgan. And that rule, which was never a rule given by the trustees, continued till one very important collector, dealer, art person, man called Jean Thor, decided that some of these rules just didn't make sense. You could continue to, why would you not buy Degas? Why would you not buy Cézanne? Why would you not buy Picasso? Why would you not buy Diebenkorn? And gradually, the board was moved by his commitment. So this is an example of some change agent. I think Jean would be surprised to think of himself as a change agent, but he was. And what he insisted upon, and this has already been said, was that the level of quality, of importance, you had to justify why these works should come to an institution. And that level of quality and relevance. We might be offered the most gorgeous Chinese ceramic. It's no place at the Morgan. That's one area we're not expanding into. And so it's an ecosystem with collectors, curators and conservators, scholars, academics, some independent scholars, dealers who are often, Gene was a great dealer, he also wrote a catalogue raisonné of Jackson Pollock. These worlds were, even then, are not necessarily separate. And to be honest, we are, I would say we thrive on generosity rather and donations. And that is another, in a way, as your ecosystem is talked about, when you finally have created collectors who've made major collections and they feel this is something that can last and be open to given to the public, museums and libraries are potentially very good stewards. So I think we don't maybe create collections, but in some ways perhaps the existence of museums allows the collector and the art advisor and the dealer to put together collections that might then land somewhere very significant.
So I would love to ask, well, I have two questions for you, Colin. First of all, I want to point out something interesting, which is that people sometimes don't think of art dealers as having collections themselves. Sean happens to have a wonderful collection, which I've had the pleasure of seeing at your house up in Chatham. And he actually made a donation, a quite large and interesting donation of materials related to James Joyce to the Morgan Library. So the Morgan is the beneficiary of one of my favorite authors, James Joyce. And so I wanted to ask you, Colin, a couple of things. In terms of the museum as a place where a collection is built, I'm curious, and I'm not sure this directly applies to the Morgan, you can tell me, but when I used to report a lot on art fairs, I would see, and I'm talking more in the contemporary context, but I suppose you could talk about this at TFAF and certainly at TFAF in Maastricht. I would see trustees groups going around with the director of the museum and, wanting to get the story. I would often then go to those booths and I would say, oh, I saw the MoMA group was here, are there any? Or a dealer would say, well, this was bought by a museum. I can't tell you which one, but you can say that it was sold to an institution. And when someone would sometimes let it slip that it was whatever museum, maybe it was MoMA that bought something, they would say, I would go to the museum and I'd say, can I report that? And they would say, no, because there's a process. So enlighten us. What is the process? What is that acquisition process?
And the number of processes, there can be so many, they can be very different. Sometimes you can buy something because at a certain price that doesn't need approval. Sometimes you have someone who's paying a check, writing a check there and then. A work is not accessioned, publicly accessioned, until a committee and a board have approved it. And so while it can be extremely exciting to have either an endowed fund or a generous benefactor at a fair to absolutely say we're buying this, there's no question. It's the trustees of an institution who have the responsibility to accept work. And they then need to be, as due diligence, they need to have the certainty as far as they can that the title is clear, that the work has an unblemished early provenance. And so that, I would think, is why you can't really just say, we bought it.
Because it's still in the pipeline. So I'll just offer a little insight to the audience. As someone who's been writing about art institutions for years, I probably read museum wall labels more than maybe, and I look at different things, but you can see, if you look, you can see the date of accession. If you know how to read those numbers, you can see this was added to the collection in 2010, or you might see something as a promise gift, or you see what collection it's from, and this is all very interesting in relation to where will these artworks end up in the world, and will I ever get to see it again? So that's a little bit of nerdy stuff. So I also wanted to ask you, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, and again, this is not maybe related so much to the Morgan, but we now have this phenomenon of the private museum, and I wonder if you can talk a little bit about, there are collectors who form these private museums, and they often put their names on them, and they're often amazing institutions. Some of them, like the Broad in Los Angeles, have enormous endowments and will, and when you have a $200 million endowment, there's a good chance you will be there in 20, 30 years. Some of them do not have that set up, and it's unclear where this art will be in 10 or 20 years. So I wonder if you can talk about a little bit about, I don't know, maybe the museum position on that.
I've worked in more single-person museums than in general museums. I've worked at the Frick, the Kimball, the Morgan. There's the Stuart Gardner, there's the Barnes, there's Norton Simon. And these are museums that are not just contemporary at all, or even primarily modern and contemporary. It's a long history, and in some ways, I think it's because the larger museum can't always accommodate all of the ambitions and aspirations, historically at least, of the individual owner. When the Annenbergs had their Impressionist and Post-Impressionist collection, when they decided they were not going to keep it in Sunnerlands in Palm Springs, but they were going to look for a museum for it, one of the things that they really wanted was to find a way that it could be separated. And so at the Met, when you see the Annenberg collections brilliantly integrated, all of the Annenberg pictures stay together. Mm-hmm. Now that is very, very hard if you are, and if you really feel that this is your life's work. I would say that good directors and good trustees today, I may get in trouble for saying this, should do their utmost to discourage that they should, in a way, that museums with all the expertise and opportunity for scholarship, for conservation, for programming, in all efforts to try and bring works in to add to the depth and richness of the existing institutions. It won't always be the choice that the great collector benefactor will make, but I feel that it's something that we should be attentive to.
Right, and this is a very complex situation, and if you're interested in this, look up the Fisher collection at SF MoMA, and you will see a saga that relates to private museums and the terms by which a collection goes to a museum is very complicated and interesting. So I want to come back to Megan and put you on the spot. And I'd like to ask about, and I think Sean will pop in here a lot, I hope he does, and talk about kind of the profession of an art advisor. When did being an art advisor become a profession? I think when we spoke about this before the panel a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the 1980s as a kind of pivotal decade for the professionalization of this particular field.
It was, and it was certainly going on before that, both professional art advisors who were independent and advising individuals, professional art advisors who were building corporate collections. In the 60s, 70s, 80s, some corporate collections were really, very, very significant, and more corporations had art collections as part of their buildings. In 1980 is when the APAA was formed from two separate art advisor organizations. And I think we really saw in the 80s and then into the 90s especially, more independent art advisors who were not affiliated with a gallery, not affiliated with an institution, working directly with collectors and helping them to build collections. And it's been in recent years, I think, that it's just exploded. I mean, there are more art advisors, more people who are coming right out of school and saying that that's what they want to do. We get emails all the time from people who are, sophomores in college, and they say, I want to be an art advisor. It's like, how can you possibly know you want to be an art advisor, So it's definitely seen as this career that one, can potentially study enough and go into. And yet, really, it's something that one falls into, we believe, after spending a good amount of time doing other things and getting expertise and experience.
And what might those other things be?
Okay. So you could be working in a museum as a curator and understanding, curatorial practice and, judgment and acquiring things and connoisseurship, and bring that kind of experience and expertise, to a practice working with an individual. you might have worked at a gallery for many years and been having those kinds of interactions with clients, knowing how to work with artists, knowing how to look at art. You might be at an auction house and seeing all of those transactions. So, a degree in art history is a start, and that's a great place to start. It's experience in the market and in transactions. It's experience making judgments and exercising connoisseurship, because that's what people are coming to you to do, and to help them to do.
So I was looking back right before this panel when I was at Art and Auction magazine in 2009, we did a sort of round table with art advisors, and we asked, one of the things that was discussed is, in 2009, you can imagine, everything was dead. Actually, it wasn't. I mean, people like Eli Broad was buying a ton of it, But basically, the idea was, in frothy times, and we are in frothy times now, maybe at the end of frothy time, no one knows where we are now, actually. But what we do know is that, like in 2007, over the past few years, there are a lot of people saying, I'm an art advisor. And I was also recently reading a story that Katya did for ArtNet about dealers essentially, getting approached by these art advisors who just say, like, can I get this? Can I get that? Can I, So can you, Sean, and Megan also, just what do you do with that when you're getting art advisors who, how do you tell who's a professional, who's not? Can new people come into the field and be actually good at it and respected when you have so many people who are all over the place?
Well, I think we're talking about this as if there is a sort of herd mentality out there, and the art advisors are all stampeding across the art world, hoovering things up. I mean, it just doesn't work like that. I mean, the reality is that, like anything else in the world, there are good art advisors, there are great art advisors. And there are less great art advisors. There are great art dealers, there are less great art dealers. I think the word that hasn't come up yet, which I think is absolutely central to this conversation, and we've all used the word connoisseurship, and I do think that that's the foundation of what we all aspire to do, and hopefully we do. But the word that hasn't come up yet is morals. And I
we also haven't said transparency yet. That is related.
Megan used the word transparency, and I responded to it immediately, because this is one of the key words here for me, which is transparency and behaving in a moral way. I mean, the biggest alarm bell for us as dealers is if an art consultant, an art advisor comes back on the booth without, or back to the gallery without their client, and starts to negotiate with us after they have left their client. Because the first question that I have, and my colleagues who work at the gallery have in that context, is, does your client, who is paying you, does your client know that you are having this conversation? And if that is not the case, we just won't deal with that person. Because it's a conversation which is rife for abuse, frankly. And I think one has to be very, very careful. And we all have a fiscal responsibility and a fiduciary responsibility. Both, you said we work for the artist, we do, but we also work for our clients. And we have to be, very alert to that. And I know that Megan is as well. And, the great and good art consultants are too. It's a very important thing. There has to be a degree of transparency to this transactional conversation, which is very, very important. And of course, if access to an artist or to a body of work is involved, then you're going to prioritize people that you feel comfortable with, doing business with, and you know that they're behaving in a transparent, moral way, and that you have a relationship with and you've worked with over a long period of time.
So I think, I would love to hear what you have to say about that, but I think to contextualize this, and you can tell me if this is a bad example, but I think the most extreme example of poor behavior of an art advisor, and it is an extreme example, is maybe some of you have read about Bouvier and Rybolovlev, which was essentially this Russian collector was relying on this, well, I don't know, he ran free ports, but he was essentially relying on this man as his art advisor. And Bouvier would buy things for Rybolovlev, but essentially he was marking them up and I mean, according to this lawsuit, and he was marking them up and keeping some of it for himself. So that was hundreds of millions of dollars. But are there many, actually I have another question, are there many situations like that? Is that essentially what you're talking about? You want to make sure the art advisor is not skimming off the top?
I think there are very few examples like that, honestly.
Okay.
And I think, you know, we have worked with many clients and advisors over the last 35 years and built many collections. And I think that the instances of that are very few. I'm just citing it. I'm citing the moral issue as being an important issue, right. As it should be in any walk of life. And you know, if that standard is breached in some way, that's a sort of canary in the coal mine for us, and we you know, the alarms go off. But I think they're very few and far between. The truth of the matter is that most people that we're working with, and most consultants and art appraisers, are really good at what they do.
Yes.
And they are an incredible help to us, because when I started in this business, you know, and I'd just like to say that before I was involved as a dealer, I was a curator and I was a museum director. And Sarah made reference to the fact that my wife and I gave a collection to the Morgan Library, which we did, and we were thrilled that it went to the Morgan Library. But the point of that was that I was not collecting. I was trained not to collect in the area in which I was functioning professionally. So the collection that went to the Morgan was of contemporary literature. It was not of contemporary art. So I just wanted to make that point. It's an important point. You know, but when I first started out, you could sort of liken the art world to being a bit like a sort of stream meandering through a meadow. And sometime sort of late in the 90s, it turned into the Orinoco in full flood. And you know, God knows it was coming at us from every direction. It was like the tempest. And it hasn't really stopped since. Sure. So a good art advisor is an incredible asset.
Yes.
Not just to the client, but to us too, because we know, and there are many of them sitting in this room that I know and respect deeply. We know that if they walk in the door, there's a degree of sorting out the wheat from the chaff has already occurred.
Okay, so I want to ask you, Megan, about one of the things that was in Katja's recent article about art advisors was, she says that the APAA has 151 approved members internationally, up from 111 in 2013. I guess that would indicate to me that you're pretty discerning about who you're adding.
We are, yeah. And I think the other aspect of our membership is that most art advisors are working in their own discrete little pods. We're not as public or easy to find as, say, you know, art dealers and gallerists that you might invite to join the ADAA if they have those qualifications. We only hear about the art advisors who are, you know, practicing as we do, whose business practices align with our code of ethics. We only hear about that from, you know, maybe a conversation with Sean, or another art advisor is introduced to an art advisor. We don't often find each other. So I think we know as an organization there are others out there who are working in a way that aligns with us. And we're working very much to build our membership, especially internationally. But we are extremely discerning, and it's hard because while we're transparent with our clients, it's hard to necessarily figure out how another art advisor is working, because they, of course, have to be very confidential about their clients and their practices. Right. So it's tough to add those members. But we speak with other dealers about, you know, people who are candidates for membership. We speak with the auction houses, and we get a real sense of, you know, who is working in that way, who has that expertise, and who aligns with our ethics.
So speaking of aligning with ethics.
Yes.
Is there an instance in which you would turn down a client? And what would that, you know, is there a collector you wouldn't want to work with, and what would that look like? I mean, obviously there's lots of ways it could look, but just give us one example.
And I have, yes. Collectors who, I don't even know if we would call them collectors, people who want to buy art and they want to flip it. Mm-hmm. They, you know, the only conversation when they come to me is all about money. Now, my collectors don't want to spend too much money on a great work of art. They want to buy something well. They may want to know that it's going to hold its value. They may not care. But somebody who's coming in who really just wants to create an investment business out of buying art, I'm not their girl, right? Maybe someone else is, but that's not me. It's not that that's unethical. It's just not what I do, and it's not what I want to get involved in.
And have you seen colleagues of yours, and we shouldn't name names, but
Yes.
but let's no, just
Okay.
kidding. But have you seen, colleagues of yours in the world of art advising take on a client who then decided to start flipping artworks, and then the art advisor's reputation is affected by that? Is that something that has happened, that you've seen happen?
I would imagine that it has. I think we are so close to our chests about what we're doing, who we're working with, and what we're buying. We don't really hear about it. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just not a great part
I hear
of
about
the
it all the
ecosystem.
time. And yeah, I mean, I absolutely do. And there are clients that we just refuse to sell to. And there are names, probably all the professionals in this room know the same names that I know and that you know. And there are people that are notorious for it. There are people who've made a living from it. There are flippers who are very active. And it's up to the individual galleries to decide whether they're going to participate in that process or not. We certainly would not. But there are other galleries who are more than happy to do so, and they make a living out of doing so.
So
But that's just how the world is, right? There's lots of different choices in life.
But we do have to vet our clients. I mean, I'm one person with a small staff, and how many people can I really take on? And so you have to be discerning about the people that you decide you're going to work with,
Right.
whether that's for a short-term project or a much longer-term project.
Well, so I want to bring up something which it was a lawsuit that came up, and I will outline this in broad strokes and not name names because it really doesn't matter. But it was a situation where a lawsuit came out of the fact that an individual who was known as a collector, collecting for himself and for supposedly a private museum, it turned out was actually, in some instances, buying for another collector, essentially acting as an advisor and acquiring works for this other collector. I direct this to both of you. When you hear about something like that happening, and it becomes public because it's a lawsuit and it's public information and journalists can see it, does sort of your heart sink because you're like, oh, now everyone's going to be that much more guarded and skeptical, and now I realize, like, who did I just sell a painting to, like this kind of thing? Like, what's your reaction when you see that?
Well, we already know about it before it's in the press normally. I mean, it's sort of the word on the street, so we probably already know about it anyway. And of course it's disappointing. I mean, it's disappointing, it's distasteful to us. And, one doesn't want to see anybody in one's profession behaving in an unethical manner. But, frankly, after 2008 with the banking crisis, it made art dealers look good. So I think, we're okay.
But we are in a moment of, or at least we were last fall. We'll see what happens at the day sales. But we are in a moment where there's a lot of speculation, especially with younger artists. Does that make this a challenging time for your profession and for your profession?
Not for me within my practice. It's hard to speak for the whole, profession because there are so many different people operating in it. But the systems, the protocols, the agreements with my clients are so clear that it's simple. So these things that happen that are out there, and that you read about in the news, lawsuits like the one you brought up and other lawsuits that are in the news right now, you see those, and of course it's disconcerting, and part of you worries, or part of me worries, like, God, are they going to think that we're all like this, right? And that collectors need to be wary of art advisors, or do you simply stand on the foundation of your own business, the practice you've built, and say, no, it's not a worry, that's out there. There are bad actors, that's fine. This is how we work, and those things have never unsettled our clients.
So let's turn to a good actor. So give me an example. Again, we're not, attaching names to this, but give me an outline of a collection that you have worked on for a long period of time that you're proud of, and maybe that has resulted in some pieces going to a museum or being planned to go to an institution of some kind.
If you can.
I know, that's so hard, Sarah. It is so hard. I'm almost kind of mushing several different clients together to create a story, a composite.
Give us a composite.
So I am working with a collection that's been, built over the last, let's say, 20 years. Not all through me, but I'm coming in now because the collector is looking to make legacy plans with, what am I going to do with this collection? And is part of it going to be a private institution that this person will build? Will these be, loans in various locations around the world? So we're only just starting now to think about how to shape that collection into something that is not only personal but can be, really accessed by the public. So I think that's a story to be continued because we're really in the strategic planning phases of that. Another collection that I did build from absolutely nothing with a couple is going to her alma mater, and that was always the goal. She knew that the things that she was buying were things that she and her husband loved, and they were not things that their children were necessarily going to want to have. And she decided as we started building and she became more passionate about what she was buying,